Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining this next edition of Museum Experts webinar series. We are very happy to have you today. I'm Walter Stavelo, the founder and president of museumexpert.org, and a very happy president today because we have so far 400 of you registered for this webinar, which makes it, I think, the biggest that we have had so far. And I know it's certainly not because of my world famous introductions, but probably because of the team and the speakers that we have assembled today, as well as the partnership that we have with AASLH, who has promoted this webinar in a fantastic way. So thanks to them for that. And thanks as well for AAM again to provide us with the platform to allow us to do this, to accommodate this big group around this webinar. So just a few words, thanking already the editors and the speakers for joining us today, but Marsha will do a much more presentation in depth of all of that. I just want to say a few words about the context in which we do that. For Museum Expert, over the last months, we have evolved very strongly into a place where we are convinced that because of the way museums have responded to COVID, the way they have been trying to move out of it, and the problems that they have had with that, there is undoubtedly a number of open questions and a number of stress still remaining in museums. And we had these webinars with John Falk about well-being in museums. And we wanted to continue that and see if we as a small organization can contribute to bring some conversation about what is going on in the museums and how can we actually in museums build a community where people work together to actually resolve these stress and these burnout or other contradictions that still exist. We came across the book, of course, then from that Marsha and Avi and Ken have edited, and we thought that a lot of answers and maybe more questions were in the book. And so we thought that was actually the next step for us to do and start a series here with them. This is the first probably of 3 that we will do over the next month or so. And so one more thing is that for you who are interested and you still don't have the book, if you go to the editor's website and you use the code RLFANDF30, and we put it in the chat, it's RLFANDF30, you will get a 30% discount when you buy it. So please make sure that you do that. So it's in the chat right now. At the end, Colleen, who is organizing this webinar for us, will check the questions that there are in the chat, and then we will, depending on the time that we have, address some of these questions. So please feel free to add your questions and comments in the chat. We know from experience that it's usually very, very active, so we're not worried about that. And by this, thanks again for being here. Marsha, the whole floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Walter, and thank you, Colleen, for piloting this webinar. I also want to thank Roman and Littlefield and ASLH for publishing the book, and thank AAM for allowing us to use its platform. So just a couple of words about the book. The book grew out of a series of Zoom conversations and blogs that involved Avi Dector, Ken Ellis, and me, beginning in the spring of 2020. And we just convened people we knew and just spread the word to talk about how they were feeling and what was on their mind as so many museums shut down and as the nested crises of the pandemic and the need to address systemic racism loomed large, affecting all of us one way or another. But I think Avi, Ken, and I also believe deeply that the need for major change predates the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the pandemic. There have been many signals from our communities, our funders, our staff members, and other stakeholders that our prevailing models were based on some outmoded forms of leadership, of organizational hierarchy, of stewardship, of ineffective community engagement practices, and internal processes, specifically, as I think everyone will realize and acknowledge, our DEAI processes. So what we did in the book was we invited 48 museum professionals spanning different disciplines, different generations, different ethnicities, and different types of disciplines, to write short essays that are not case studies, but they're personal op-eds about what needed to change and what needs to be different as we think about museums. If we privileged any of our contributors, it was people whose voices have not been heard in press as much, and especially BIPOC museum professionals, of whom we know we have many, many talented and yet not necessarily recognized examples. So today I want to thank three of our writers, Sam Moore, a founding director of the brand new Moonshot Museum in Pittsburgh, Sue Oh, Senior Vice President for Education, Exhibitions, and Community Engagement at the Natural History Museums of Los Angeles County, and Franklin Vagnone, President of the Newport Restoration Foundation. Each of their essays looked inward, focused, and they were sprinkled throughout the book. So they didn't have a chance to really meet each other until we planned for this conversation. But each of their essays focused on the necessary changes in our sector that took on extra urgency during the pandemic and that predate March 2020. Their pieces address the people who work within our museums. And in fact, Frank's essay is titled, "Protect People, Not Things." So the overarching question that we're going to converse about today is how, given the continued uncertainties, anxieties, and stresses that swirl around our museums, some of which are new in the last few months, and which affect all of us who work within our museums, how can we create a community inside the museum where all feel that they belong? So I'm going to facilitate our conversation, but we are encouraging our participants to talk among themselves too. And then we'll go on for a while, and then Avi Dechter is going to have some concluding remarks. In the meantime, Colleen and I will be monitoring the chat, and I assume that some of the things that you bring up will become the subject or be addressed by our presenters. So again, I want to thank Sam, Sue, and Frank for taking time to do this with us, for writing for us. And I want to start by giving each of you an opportunity to give a bit of an introduction to the current context in which you work, because you work in different size and different types of institutions. And if we talk about organizational culture, I think knowing something about the context will be helpful for all of us. So Sam, starting in alphabetical order, will you give us a shot, or will you blast us off?
Oh, very nice. Yes, thanks, Marsha. So as Marsha mentioned, I'm the director at Moonshot Museum, brand new museum that just opened about 10 days ago. And we are a small organization. We have a total team of 5 and a volunteer corps of about 25. So a small organization, but this is a relatively recent career move for me. I've been here for just shy of 2 years. And when writing, and initially when thinking about my essay, I was with the National Aviary in Pittsburgh, considerably larger organization, a team of 35, a total staff of well over 100. And my essay on focused on hiring and advancement in museums, I think is informed by both of those perspectives. Oh, you're muted, Marsha.
Can't hear you, Marsha.
Sue, how about you?
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you, meet you virtually. I'm at the Natural History Family of Museums in Los Angeles County. We have the Natural History Museum in Exposition Park, the La Brea tar pits in Hancock Park, and then what is still currently closed, the William S. Hart Museum and Ranch. We have about 400 some employees across all the museums, and my department, I'm an executive that reports directly to the president and director, and I have about 100 some employees in my department with about 20 to 30 seasonal temporary hires, mostly for the summer. And my essay was about empowering our early entry staff members, those who are digital natives and who've adapted quite a bit, and our frontline staff in some cases during COVID, and just the empowerment of that and deconstructing just the typical power structures that are and the hierarchies of a museum that run day to day. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And how about Frank?
So when I wrote the article, I was president and CEO of Old Salem Museums and Gardens and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, around 137 employees, around a $6 million endowment, 100 acres living history site with a decorative arts museum. I presently am president of the Newport Restoration Foundation, which is an interesting hybrid. We own around 80 historic colonial homes that are rented out and maintained. So it's deeply embedded into the town village of Newport. And we own and run Rough Point, which was Doris Duke's home in Newport. And then we also have a decorative arts museum. So the situation is considerably different. Old Salem was very tightly contained, and the Newport Restoration Foundation is just deeply embedded into the urban fabric of Newport. And I also look forward to chatting with everyone.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, why don't we start the conversation and we'll see where it leads us. So one of the things you all wrote about in slightly different ways was about decision-making in a museum setting or in your museums. You know, where and how are decisions made? Where and how do people feel empowered to have their voice heard? What are some of the things that affected you maybe during the height of the COVID pandemic and that you're maintaining and using in the current situation? So I don't have a person to call on first. Anybody want to start? All right, Sue, I'm going to call on you since your essay was really about a whole way you thought about effective leadership during the height of the pandemic.
So I think a couple things during the pandemic. It's the decision-making, the communication around the decision-making, and the empowerment. All were part of what we had to do. As many of you and us similarly, we had to make a hard close of the institution, in which case the people and place part of a museum shifted very quickly. So in that shift and the buzzword of being digital and pivot, you know, there's a lot of buzzwords that come out of that time period. We actually had to do that fairly quickly. And part of what I was writing was that a lot of our staff that are more digital natives and really know this medium from social media all the way to just presentations were a huge help. And there was a lot of empowerment and I would say new talent and creativity that arose out of that. Some of the educators that you may not have known about as well, because you didn't have access to them on the floor during their schedule, everything was equal access. And we had some beautiful behind the scene presentations with our live animal collections, curators, different educators throughout the building. We did give them some access from home as well as on site. So I think that there's a double edge to that. There was a lot of accessibility that was increased. But in order to do that, you had to empower those folks to create voice, to create story, and to be able to share on your behalf, because the normal kind of decision-making kind of pipeline can take a while. And communication within the context of all of this is extremely important and fluid, and maybe has some missteps here and there, but we went into regular town halls, regular all staff meetings, regular assembly, intentional assembly in order to communicate to everybody. So That's a little bit in a nutshell right there.
Great. Frank, how about you? You spoke a little about this. Obviously, you were at Old Salem and now you're in a different
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah, I think we were in a fairly good spot because we had really inverted the power structure and the decision making in that we organized a leadership team of 21 people. So by the time that we actually closed on that Friday, this was 4 years before, we had started a leadership team that was working really well together. And I don't know if I can cuss here, but I remember when we closed and I thought to myself, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And I don't know if the rest of you felt this way. It's like even in a leadership team, when we had shared authority, they still, especially at that moment, needed someone to say it's going to be okay. We financially are going to be okay. Like, what's the worst case scenario? That's okay. We can move forward. And there were all of those moments that the shared leadership was so useful for me as the president because I could lean on them, but then I also really had a sense that they needed to lean on me. And I would say that through that and the real honesty of, it was a great equalizer because none of us on this call have ever really gone through a situation just like that. So it's not like any of us knew what we were doing. That the leadership structure, this shared collaborative leadership structure, was incredibly important at making difficult decisions. What to do with programming, frontline, healthcare, the list goes on and on, all those things you just never thought about. It was just a really powerful mechanism. And we had just moved to Teams, Microsoft Teams, which allowed us to instantaneously have that collaborative effort virtually. So we were in a good spot because 4 years we had managed to organize that. We didn't have to rush to do it. But at the same time, everything we were doing, just like everyone on this call, was new to us.
So what led you to do this 4 years ago?
I was hired at Old Salem to come in and really make some significant transformations. And on many levels, the staff was just incredibly sophisticated and strong, but the communication was not good at all. Lots of siloed. We hear this a lot with museums. And so what I tried to do is just put everybody in a room together to hear what everyone else was doing. And it was just one of the initial mechanisms for each of us to realize that they weren't the only one working really hard, that there were lots of other people working really hard. So that hurdle had already been reached before COVID, but it was very helpful during COVID to see even people who might have been front line were still working really, really hard because we had this leadership team to come to every Tuesday.
So Frank, I never told you this, I don't think, but I learned about what you were doing at Old Salem from a friend of mine in an innovation group who works for a grocery store. And we had a conversation and she said, I'm a member of Old Salem and I read the president's messages to us, which were something like running with scissors or something with scissors. And she said, you really have to look him up, Marsha. So that's how I tapped into some of the things that you were doing. So I know we're talking about inside, but I picked up on how you were messaging this to your community.
And that's significant because early on, we realized the value of videos. And what I did is I established the president's office as a communication tool. And so I did regular president's updates through video. And I talked about everything. The first reaction I remember was, don't tell everybody how much money we're losing because they'll think that we're going to close. And in fact, I very quickly pushed the opposite. I said, no, everybody needs to know what's happening with everyone. And so those president's reports, if you watch them, they're boring, don't worry about it. But those reports were very specifically to answer questions before people asked them, because none of us knew what was going on. So I tried to answer them before we had those questions. But thanks for saying that.
Well, and I want to turn to Sam, but I also have to say you were my introduction to TikTok. So thank you for that too. So Sam, you were moving, as you explained, from, you were mostly at the National Aviary, but you'd also been at the Heinz History Center, I think, and now you're in your new digs. Why don't you talk to this issue of effective decision making?
Certainly. Yeah, I think in preparing for this call, we huddled, and something that came up that I think we all three agreed on was this idea that whether or not you were able to, an organization was able to keep its full team on, or a partial team, or a really limited team, chances are good that you ended up working with colleagues that you certainly probably worked with and knew fairly well, but you were deep in the trenches, right? Constantly with them, constantly on Teams, constantly on Zoom calls throughout that period. And so those that bond building, that relationship building across different levels of leadership, I certainly found to be the case at the National Aviary. As we've begun, we've really, at Moonshot Museum, we've been building a new organization through COVID, right? And through this period that we're now at in the pandemic. And so building a new organization, building structures from scratch, building a leadership model and a staffing model from scratch with some lessons learned from COVID over the past couple of years has been really interesting. And it's easier for us because we don't have a lot of voices at the table. We've got 5 altogether, 3 full-time and 2 part-time. But our days start in conversation and on the same page. Our days end in conversation and on the same page. And I think I agree, Frank, the lessons taken away from, one of the lessons taken away from COVID is this idea that things that I think we are inclined as organizations and leaders in museums to really shy away from being open about when it comes to finances, when it comes to cash flow, when it comes to operations and how we make decisions, particularly around human resources related decisions, right? Those are conversations that I think we're all going to be a lot more likely as leaders and organizations to have more freely moving forward. Something, Sue, you wrote in your piece is that has stuck with me is this idea of the mirror being turned around, right? And really having some challenging conversations through COVID with team members who may have seen their colleagues step away or be furloughed or be laid off. And I think I certainly as a new leader in museums took lessons away from that and have really worked to make sure that my team now, my small team, is up to speed on what our bottom line looks like, what our our financial structure looks like, knows why the revenue targets are what they are, and knows why the fundraising targets are what they are, right? And I think it's certainly it's leveled the playing field when it comes to keeping the books and understanding the books. And I hope that's a change that sticks around in this new kind of paradigm that we're in.
Well, and just as a follow-up to you, Sam, how do you see this working as you scale up?
Sure. So we'll always be fairly small, but as we grow the team, instilling that culture of clear and open lines of communication, of building systems, whether it's Slack or Teams, that keep us in touch with each other, and not hanging on to something. I think another thing we learned from the pandemic is it's really silly to hang on to something until the next weekly meeting to kind of deal with it and move on it, right? I think very few of us still operate that way in museums 2-3 years later. So just continuing that atmosphere and that culture of collaboration and communication, I think, is very important. And being really, really intentional as we grow the team to make sure that they're coming in, they know what they're coming into, that they know kind of what the expectations are, that they know what the pathways are within the organization. As a small organization, I know we're not going to grow super quickly over the next couple of years. And so I'm not going to promise, grand opportunities for professional advancement for people that I'm bringing on and entry or mid-level roles, because it's just not going to happen. I do want to create an organization and a culture for them that helps them thrive and that they can, take by the horns and learn from and grow in before they step away to do something else potentially a few years from now. But that communication, that transparency, I think, is something that's going to be really central for us moving forward.
Great, thanks. Sue, how do you respond? How does that relate to you and where you are now?
I'm hearing a lot of themes that are similar. I think we're extremely transparent, both about the budget, the human resources portion, and our decision making. I think what I was hearing and what both Frank and Sam were saying, this idea of shared leadership was based on values. I mean, I think someone made a comment about there needs to be leader, but if your value system is there when you make those decisions, it is extremely helpful. And we did value and prioritize the staff before the things, as Frank mentioned. And actually, that kind of similar value set actually helped make the decisions easier. I have to say that I thought our executive team did extremely well in this, even though it was really scary and people had to deal with their personal life bleeding into their work lives. And so we want to bring forward what we call a more inclusive decision-making process, but still try to have some of the flexibility and the efficiency of what happened during that time period.
Great. Frank, your hand is up.
Yeah, I just want to coattail onto that. Even when your values are in the right place, like at Old Salem, labor laws seem to be massive obstacles for us to make decisions that could benefit the employees. I remember talking about severance and how severance would have an implication on the special COVID aid, and that they wouldn't start the COVID aid until the severance package was fulfilled and used up, which meant that the employee would actually just come out with a zero net, right? And so what we did is we spent so much time trying to figure out how we could bypass what seemed to me to be brick walls everywhere we turned in trying to deal with these special circumstances. It became harder and harder. And I just give that one example, and finally, we started to give COVID self-care days because we tried to create ways that were outside of the system, because quite frankly, the system seemed to be hindering the needs of the staff and what they needed. And I don't know if the rest of you found this to be the case, but as hard as we tried to be good stewards of the process, I felt like it was constant shut doors in terms of laws, procedures, policy, HR, exempt employees being able to work from home, but non-exempt were not allowed to work from home, things like that just were mind-blowing at the time. I just throw that out if you guys felt this.
You're right. I mean, it was extremely challenging, and we learned a lot as a result, because I think when you were talking about the book Change is Required, change is constant, actually. And in this case, what we were saying, exponential, that those of us who do like change, this was extremely challenging on multiple levels. And then to try to be a leader and a human being at the same time, you're making these business decisions that are affecting people's lives. So it wasn't. And we have very specific laws in California. We also now have wellness days that we've added, just like you have, because mental health, as we have all agreed, has been something that has been pulled forward during this pandemic, both from the pandemic as well as all the racial uprising that happened soon after. They were both extremely emotional and traumatic for many people.
Yeah, they were, we talked briefly about this before. As leaders, we were going through personal issues ourselves, with family members getting ill and caretaking, as well as our staff, at the same time that we're trying to manage something that is a black hole and no one knows where it's going. So I think it was true for everyone. We were all just trying to move forward in what seemed like darkness, like we just didn't know where it was going.
Yeah, and go ahead, Sue, please.
I just, we all wish like we could start with a new museum. And if you could start with a new museum, what would you do that we've kind of mistakenly, worked through, I guess? And where's the opportunities and challenges in that?
Yeah.
That's one for you, Sam.
Well, yeah.
Completely rhetorical.
It is particularly fitting, isn't it? So I think this idea that daily operations don't have to look the same as they did before. Certain programming doesn't have to come back that we did before.
Yeah.
We should look really closely at capacity and what we have the capacity to do, even if that means 3 weeks from now, we can't do something we did 3 weeks ago. Right. I think in some ways, COVID has made our visiting public, a little bit more understanding of how flexible and fluid our operations can be, in some cases should be, based on staffing levels, based on just general capacity to do the things that we would like to do. And so being able to, as we build Moonshot Museum, and now that we're open with Moonshot Museum, fielding a lot of partnership requests and interest, and being really strategic in choosing where we're tabling and where we're doing outreach and what on-site programs we're doing and who we're partnering with, because the partnership for the sake of partnership, or the doing something to say we've done it and move on to the next thing, right? Are really analyzing hard, are these the best uses of our time and energy and resources? Is this actually going toward our core mission? Can we do these other things and also keep the doors open every day? And we found in a lot of those analyses of kind of what day-to-day looks like at Moonshot Museum, especially in these opening days, it was like, no, we really need to focus on our core operations. We need to focus on reaching the audiences we're most committed to reaching, and making on-site work before we even really think about, if we stretched ourselves far, we could do these other things. But should we stretch ourselves far? No, it's not going to be good for us long term. So really thinking hard. I think a big lesson in building something new is building with moderation and thoughtfulness for our operations.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if how many of you know Micah Parson from the Museum of Us, because he's done a lot of work on the issues that the legal issues and requirements around human resources, and he happens to be an attorney as well as a CEO of a museum. But it's been a very stressful in some ways for him, but they've been very dogged in their work there to sort of challenge what they can and put in place practices that are not the norms for most organizations. So that's something some of you might want to look up. I was going to go back to Sue because we talked a lot, and it's been in the chat, the whole issue of trust, right? And in a time where there was, and I think there still is, so much uncertainty, that there's a lot of trust to be built across all of the ranks of our organization. And Frank, of course, you talked about the fact that it's not like you had the answers, in some ways you were a little bit of the wizard operating behind the screen. And, so creating that sense of trust. And, so you talked about how much you like change. So I like change too, but I've known the people I work with aren't so comfortable with change, especially when it's their personal livelihoods. And I'm just wondering a little more perhaps about the building trust. And in recent months, some of you're a little more like an ocean liner, Sue, and you're huge.
Yes.
The other two of our panelists probably have a little more nimbleness. I'm not sure, Frank, about Newport and nimbleness in Newport, but how are you doing that? I mean, in terms of, are some people just saying goodbye and we don't want to be part of this anymore? Are some people, are those people who stood up and in new ways, are they still, have they been promoted? Are they, do they have a little more recognition? Or I think everyone in museums I know has talked about departing staff or the challenges of hiring staff.
Yeah.
All of the above.
Yeah.
I think sometimes the change makers are the ones that show the mirror, and then they're the ones that also leave. And other times they stay. I love promoting from within if possible. That is, I think that a good mix of staff. I came from the outside, to be frank. I was not a museum career person. This is my second career, or maybe my third, if you want to count a few of the others prior. I think a solid mix of both is actually good for an organization, that kind of diversity. And then where does equity fit in all of this? Actually, it's not just about valuing your staff, but some staff have different privileges than others. Frontline has different privileges than a manager who sits at their desk, and balancing all of that. And I think people reset their values during this time. We do meaningful work, but within that meaningful work, is this institution still aligned with my personal values? And I think those are moving closer. I took on community engagement right before COVID hit, and exhibitions during, and because the values of where we're going as an institution actually aligned quite a bit with what I want as an individual, it was a good change for me, because I do believe in the community engagement and inclusion and all the things that were arising. I was actually happy for that kind of revolution, frankly. And it made me want to stay longer. It doesn't make it easy, but I think that those individuals who change their value systems and that might not have felt that the organization is matched up in the right time and place for them may have left. And I like to think if we did a good job, they're doing great things in new places too. And that is its own form of validation of a community that you built here. And all of it takes time, period. There's no rushing some trust.
Yeah, that's good. And Frank, and I just want to point out in the chat, Preeti Gupta makes an allusion to an article she wrote that I think is a really good resource. So I hope you all, it's called What We Learned About Leadership in a Crisis. But I'll turn it over to you, Frank.
I was just going to say that actually COVID allowed me to get closer to the level of community engagement that I always imagined. Very quickly, because of our shared leadership team, people were coming up with ideas. The idea of us transforming all of our educational garden space to vegetable production for local food banks, that happened within a week. That came from our leadership team. The idea of taking all of our historic bakeries, which were kind of interpreted bakeries, and turning them around and making bread for families in need in Winston-Salem. Like, these sorts of things were incredibly important and things I wanted to do all along. But for instance, people wouldn't let me do that because they said Moravians weren't growing those kinds of vegetables at the time, and we could only grow vegetables that Moravians grew. And when COVID hit, I was able to say, I don't care, I want to feed families. And so in some ways, a kind of shared leadership allowed me the strength and validity to do that kind of community engagement that you're talking about. And I will also say that this made financial sense, because early on, those things were the things that brought in money, that helped me rehire the horticulture staff, rehire the other teams, the bakery staff. Like, it allowed me to do things that I couldn't have done unless we started doing that level of community engagement. Again, it's not what we did before COVID, but even though I've left, I do believe that Old Salem's keeping some level of food production for food banks and bread production for families in need.
That's so fabulous. That's really, yeah, it's really important. So it's a both and yet I ran a historic living history site once, and I would have had the exact same objections. This was back toward the end of the last century, though, but I'd like to think that there's been some switching into that kind of mindset. Sam?
Stu, yeah, I was going to say, Stu, you said something that I want to pick up on a couple minutes ago around, you know, the importance of our work, right? Our work is important, and I think we as a museum field, I certainly saw this on our leadership team and have tried to carry this through now at Moonshot Museum, is that qualifier is pretty important, and I think it got more important during COVID. And I think if there is something good that sticks with us as a field coming out of the pandemic, it's the chipping away. It's certainly not broken down yet, but the chipping away of this kind of employment in museums, the privilege model of working in museums, right? That there's enough exciting stuff that we're doing that it makes up for museums kind of being tough places to work on occasion. And I think as leaders, I think it's really important for us to move forward, not only having learned a lot about our own work-life balance during COVID, which I think I can speak for all three of us on this call was terrible, right? And made us to do some pretty serious reckoning with what we were looking for in work and what work was taking out of us. And I think approaching, certainly as I've hired our small team at Moonshot Museum, making really, really clear that like there's a job for you to do here and it's exciting and we're going to expect the best from you, but also it's 20 hours a week or it's 40 hours a week. And if you go over that, we owe you that time back. We owe you the ability to be whole after your work week. We owe you the ability to unplug. You don't owe us, you're our employee, right? So if you're delivering and you're going above and beyond, then we owe you the difference. And making that really clear as part of our culture at Moonshot as we've gotten started up has been central for me. And I think as I look at places that I've worked, you know, the National Aviary, the Heinz History Center, the Missouri Historical Society, what I see across those organizations and across the field are just not monumental shifts in HR policy necessarily, but shifts in those manager direct report relationships where those things are said out loud and said explicitly. So that everyone is on the same page about having the flexibility that should be inherent in our work.
I have to say, I like to challenge our field to push up the value. And I know it's an operational budget thing, but if we go through a comp study, we comp ourselves against other museums, and oftentimes it becomes the cement walls that we're kind of stuck in. And it's really, really discouraging because I'm actually trying to fight against what the field is doing. Because what are the couple things that make us unique as a museum, and what combination of things do that? And being housed in education before I got exhibitions and community engagement, it's really been such a slog pre-pandemic and even during to try to get the educators at a level that, as Ben Garcia said at AAM, you don't need a comp study to do the math on living wage. So it's not just the individual challenge of this organization or institution. This is the challenge of all of us at this field and those of us who get into leadership to continue to push against our worst selves, frankly. So I'm with you on that, Sam, but I challenge all of us in those leadership positions to keep pushing that, so that when the comp study comes back, it isn't the same salary I got when I started in this field. Frankly.
Exactly. And Frankie, you wrote about this in your essay, this idea of this idea of continuous growth, right? We have to expand our headcount. We have to keep growing, 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 growing. Like you're paying your frontline people $8.50 an hour to grow, grow, grow. Is that actually good for the field? And I'd argue no, right? What can we do to pay our folks well within the framework of our mission? And what does that mean for our size at the end of the day? It probably means we're smaller and our footprint is a little bit smaller, right?
And that's someone mentioned this in the chat, and that is really difficult for most boards to understand.
Right.
Because they're coming from a corporate philosophy, and they're also coming out of decades, go-go decades of getting bigger, bigger, build bigger, new museums, acquire more things, get your staff bigger. What's your attendance? All of us have had to fill out grant applications where we have to like make ourselves puff up to sound great. The truth is, I have to stand there and say, no, the strength and power is in pausing and realizing your right size might be smaller than what it is right now. Given your endowment, given your mission, given your staff size, given your buildings, and I think that's as a president, as a leader, that's probably one of the most difficult things for me to keep pushing back on boards is smaller, more focused, more intentful. Those are the places that museums need to be, not the opposite. Maybe in some cases the opposite is good, but most of the time I don't think that's the best place to be.
Well, there's that book, Good to Great, Jim Collins, which I was told to read. I mean, we might have to show the business folks that book to remind them that we maybe should do a little bit less and do it better. There's hundreds of museums and thousands across the nation that we can all share the cultural space together and provide opportunities and not be competitive, but additive to our societies and our collective beings. So yeah, I enjoy our board. So, but they can also do the math as well, right? So that's the harsh reality. We said this earlier, y'all, that we are still businesses, whether we operate from a mission-based agenda or not. But anyway, I got to bring that book. I'm going to brush that book off and bring.
Yeah, Ben Garcia actually has a piece in our book, just to give another plug, which is very much around this issue of equity in compensation. And he actually he suggests some really interesting ratios that could be applied. So he's dealing with both of these issues. So we have about 10 more minutes. I guess, one of the things I wanted to build on a little bit is some of the tensions that we've heard in some of our Zoom sessions around the importance of diversifying staff at all levels. And in the context of the slimming down during COVID, also recognizing people who contributed enormously to our museums and not necessarily being able to keep everybody on. And I don't know whether anybody has anything to say about that. I know Joan Baldwin has put in the chat this whole issue of gender equity, which is a whole other issue. But I just wondered if you might have a couple of words about that. Maybe
well, at Old Salem, as I said, we had really been working on equity. It was a whole initiative, and we were doing it for close to 7 years. So there were no salary scales. There was definitely not gender equity in pay or pay parity, or even if the job was similar. There was just all kinds of discrepancies. Luckily, by the time COVID came, we had gotten very close to that kind of equity. But during COVID, we also tried to up salaries, again, of exempt and non-exempt, because we wanted to kind of keep people and make it easier in certain ways. So I mean, it hasn't always, in my time, has been a struggle to do that. And it's been, again, there have been things that I've wanted to do that I couldn't do for various reasons that just held back an organization.
Yeah.
So it can be, again, I hate to sound so frustrated sometimes, but when I'm trying to work on transformation, usually that transformation is going in a direction which is counter to the professional best practice culture, which means that all the policies and procedures are rubbing against transformation. That's one of the reasons why institutional inertia happens. You literally have friction that's keeping you in place. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we were all joking before. We're just tired. I mean, it's who used the word slog? And it's been a slog. Yeah.
Well, and just to that note, as we round third and start heading for home with, well, there's a question here about advice to organizations that are resistant to transparency, desperate to get back to normal, and so on. And this person Jay has a much longer story, but it kind of leads into my last question, which comes from one of the images you used in your piece, Frankie, which was about the being in the eye of the hurricane during the height of COVID, and your prediction that we still, when you're in the eye, if everybody has seen the musical Hamilton, it's quiet in the eye of the hurricane, right? Thank Lin-Manuel Miranda. But as you move out, you encounter even greater turbulence. And in our conversation, as we were planning for this, each of you talked about turbulence that you're still in, and you just named it, the slog. So, and Jay talks about gains that had been made pre-COVID that have been lost. So not to have your I want your last comments to be about hope, or hope, or some things, some devices that are either helping you with your own self-care or with your work in your organization, because I think you're right. Everybody's tired. It is a slog. We don't know what's coming next. So if you can summon up some hope, some hints, some suggestions, now's the time.
Everyone is tired. I am tired. My team is tired, right? And I think, and my team is new, right? They weren't working with me through the pandemic, but they also were humans who lived through, what we've been through for the past 3 years. And so we are all at this point where I'm not going to say we're all on the same page, because I know that's not true, but I think we have this real opportunity where we are all tired, and we can all acknowledge with each other that the past 3 years have been awful, that they haven't gone the way that we wanted them to, that we're really sleepy, and that we want something better after this. And I think for some people, the inclination to, back to normal, back to when I was happy, back to when life worked better for me as a leader or as an employee, maybe the initial inclination. But I think we do have this real opportunity to acknowledge that we're all tired, to figure out how we can all get some sleep, and to build a better kind of structure moving forward. I am in a unique and privileged position, and that we built something entirely new over the past 2 years. It is not that easy. At the vast majority, 99.9% of organizations. But what I would really encourage is just to sit people down, talk things out, explain what mistakes you made. We made mistakes in my previous role. I make mistakes every day in my current role. And that transparency, that acknowledgement that we're all tired, we all want to build something better. But we may all have different ideas of what that better is, and bringing people together to figure that out together. I think I've really enjoyed over the past couple of years. I found that my team has really enjoyed being part of those conversations, and there is no reason to stop that. COVID could go away tomorrow. Monkeypox could go away tomorrow. The flu could go away tomorrow. And I think we'd want to still be having those conversations, because it just makes a better place to work in.
Great, thank you. How about you, Sue?
Oh, I'm going to try to keep this concise. I am tired too, but guess what? I'm on a new fitness plan, everybody.
Right.
I use the word, I want joy. It's been my theme as we're coming into this new place, I'm getting my fitness in. And why? Because this is, I ended my essay with "We are warriors." We all of you on this call, all of us in this room have gone through a lot. It's been really traumatic, and we have to do it together. It is not on leadership or just your HR team to create diversity, equity, and inclusion in your institutions. We are all part of that. Externally facing, when we touch and meet with the public, or engage with, sorry, touch is probably the wrong word. When we engage with the public, that inclusion can be felt by any member of our institution. It is not just on the leadership, but it is having eyes open on the biases that we have and in the systems that we work in. And I'm absolutely committed to the long haul of this, but I also have a lot of staff and other leaders who are part of this movement. And let's call it a movement. Let's make it a movement. Let's let it have the energy that the marches have, that all these things have, to make progress. It needs to be bigger than our individual selves. And I believe it is starting to happen. It's already happening. But yes, sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And we have to have an entrusted, if you don't have your board of directors in your institution, and I mean a personal board of directors, you make one with other museum colleagues to keep you in check, to help counsel you through those difficult times so that you can make progress in your individual organizations and be committed to doing it. I have a lot of amazing people I work with. That's why I'm still and plan to still be in the museum field despite all its flaws. And I hope we can all do it together. And I'm just thrilled to be with these 2 other gentlemen and to share this space. I want to thank both of you.
Great. And Frank, Anna Ackerson and Joan Baldwin have written about a posse, creating your own posse, right? Who are there to support you. I think Greg Stevens has done some work on that too. So giving them some credit too. Thanks, Sue and Frank. You lead us into Avi. I'll let you.
I will say that I came out of, and I'm not out, none of us are out of the COVID lockdown. We're dealing with major employment issues right now, directly tied to everything, mental health issues. Just, I would say that I've never been more proud of colleagues as I was when I left Old Salem. And proud in a way that I was not able to before, because I wasn't as intimately involved in the everyday mechanism that technology allowed me to get involved with the rest of the staff. That's number one. Incredibly proud and aware of the power that we all bring to the collective. Really proud. And secondly, I've always felt like I wanted people to be successful. My goal was not to put people in positions or situations that they wouldn't succeed. And so between those 2 things, I mean, I would like to end in a very kind of positive sense about us as individuals and how we can collectively work together. I've just seen it happen, that Old Salem got to a point which was far greater than all of us individually, because of the system of leadership and the openness and willingness to allow each of us to be successful. That was the biggest lesson I learned during COVID. And I also am very proud of my 2 colleagues here that we're talking to, and eventually we're going to have to form our own support group. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks to all of you. It's been great. I've known you each in different ways, so it's great to see you all together. And Avi, I'll let you wrap things up.
Thank you, Marsha. Thank you to the 3 panelists as well. We've been privileged today to hear several instances of adapting to novelty, to circumstances that were not only not anticipated, but could not be anticipated, and for which there are no obvious and known solutions. So it's very clear that in each of these cases, the 3 of you were able to experiment to make new policies and new practices that were more equitable for all who work in your institutions and who also visit and use your institutions. I picked up in listening a whole bunch of simple and straightforward ideas. One is obviously that all of these issues are interconnected. There is no isolated issue that you can deal with in absolute isolation. It connects to all the other issues and structures within the institution. Secondly, expanding the leadership team goes well beyond moving past the silo effect of our institutions. It's really getting new voices in the room where the decisions are being taken. It doesn't matter what their color or gender or age or anything else is if they're not bringing new perspectives into that room. If they are bringing new perspectives into the room, then we're making an advance. It's also very clear that each of you in your own ways have created a number of intentional convenings, informal and formal, within the institution, that has created a new system of open communication within the institution, absolutely basic to creating a sense of trust. And as somebody remarked in the chat, progress moves at the pace of trust. And I think that that's really a critical business also. It's very clear that we need transparency, not only in purpose, but also we need to be honest about the opportunities and the requirements and the demands that we're putting on people. We need to take into account our colleagues' self-care and their health. We do need to expand our capacity. We have to recognize that we have institutional obligations to our staff. We need to invest in them, and we need to recognize them at every level of work. And lastly, it's very clear that we need new metrics. Our traditional metrics, namely, are we balancing our budget? How many items do we have in our collection? And how many visitors are we serving in the course of a year, are simply inadequate measures of institutional effectiveness and success. You've suggested a whole range of these new metrics today, and I think that they are really critical business. I'd like to add just one final point. Everyone in the museum world has agency in affecting change in how we distribute authority, how we shape our structures, and how we can empower ourselves and our colleagues. It doesn't always feel like that, but I think a lot of that has to do with the stance that we bring to our positions. If we think we cannot affect change, then we will be unable to affect change. If we feel that we can affect change, then we're already starting to affect change right then and there. And lastly, this conversation itself is a perfect model of new opportunities for reflection, both at the individual and institutional level, that our field has been privileged with as products of COVID. We have never had as much opportunity to stop, to think hard and carefully about what we're doing, and to develop new policies and new practices that bear a much stronger relationship to the realities that we are confronting. So I thank you for sharing your insights and your ideas. We look forward to other conversations.
Yeah, thank you all. Walter, do you say the last thing, or?
I am supposed to, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I'll stay for a little bit.
Well, I'm going to be very brief, of course, but first of all, thank you all for such a lively conversation, which we anticipated, because we have been working on this a little bit before and saying, you know, all these things that deliver, that looks like so spontaneous, they are spontaneous because they are well prepared. So thank you all for doing that with us and to be with us today and delivering on the content here. Thanks to AASLH for promoting it, and thanks to AM again for the platform. What I want to say, just a brief comment. In the chat, someone says we should continue the conversations and be going more in depth on several of these points. And that's exactly what we plan to do. So Museum Expert is here to continue these conversations and think about our museums and how we can build community in the museums to address these issues as a collective and making progress all together. In that sense, I jump on Sue's idea. We want to be the board of the colleagues, you know, to have these conversations in the future. I like that idea. So let's go for that. On the 15th of November, we will have sort of another angle to this, because we will have a session on 15th of November at 2 p.m. Eastern with Beth Tuttle on the how can people who work in museums and are suffering from all these different stresses and burnouts that we see, how can they actually, in situations where they are not themselves, actually advocate for themselves? How can they stand up? What do they need to do to be doing the job that they all like? Because that's the other thing that comes out of this. We're all passionate about that work in museums. We do things that we love and we think that it means something. But if we are not able to do it in the best way, the stress and the burnout comes. So how can you, if you want to stay in there, how can you actually stand up for yourself? And so on the 15th of November, we will give some recipes for that. So stay tuned for our newsletters and more information about that. For those who are not members of Museum Expert, it's free. You can just go to the website museumexpert.org and register, so you will receive our information regularly. And so we were a big group today, and hopefully we can keep that momentum for the coming conversations. Thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.